we, and especially Americans, we like to focus on the good stuff, the baby, the Gerber baby. But there is, behind those closed doors, there's a very raw and traumatic experience for a lot of women where that is not your reality.
Welcome to Flip Your Script, the podcast about life's critical turning points and how people find the inspiration and motivation to move forward and rewrite their unique stories. Flip Your Script is produced by Media Minefield, a public relations firm passionate about the power of sharing stories. Specializing in earned and social media, Media Minefield helps clients take control of their unique story and message. The show is hosted by Kristi Piehl, founder and CEO of Media Minefield, who flipped her script from an Emmy-winning journalist to a successful entrepreneur and speaker.
Our stories and struggles can help others, but we have to share them. And there are still some topics that are more commonly shared in chat rooms of strangers than at social gatherings with friends. In this episode, Marisa Schulz is going to share her family's Flip Your Script story that includes multiple miscarriages and adoption. Marisa only recently started talking about her private struggles. Usually she's talking with clients, college students, or the media about place, space, and design. Marisa is the co-founder and principal of All Together, and she's taught undergraduate and graduate courses at DePaul University. Welcome, Marisa.
Thank you so much, Kristi, for having me today.
It's such a pleasure that you're here and are going to talk about this. And like so many people, we meet them in some setting, and then we learn later that they have this whole other story aspect that we didn't know and we wouldn't, of course, ask about. And you're one of these people because we met through the Women's Entrepreneurship Institute through DePaul University. We've talked, professionally several times. And you reached out and said, hey, there's this other part that I think there's value in talking about. So I appreciate that you trusted me with that part of your story.
Thank you. Yes, I was one of the crazy people who launched a company early on in the pandemic. And as you can probably attest to, having launched your own company, starting something offers this incredible opportunity and a fresh start to build something that is aligned with your values and what you want to celebrate and what you want to focus on. And so with All Together, which is a place-based creative agency, a big part of our mission is to elevate the stories of women in the brands and the designs of the communities that we work in. And so when I was, thinking through the process of aligning my own values and what that means for the company, I realized that there was this gaping hole for me in my own personal story. And one that I had, for a number of reasons that I'm sure we'll talk about today, had not totally shared with most people. Because for me, this whole process of miscarriages and adoption is kind of a two-part act. And I tend to focus on that second part, which is something that we can celebrate. But I think that it's really important to focus on that first act while it was so painful. And I think that for sometimes a lot of us, it's just easier to focus on what came next. By skipping over my experiences of recurrent miscarriages and the impact of those losses and everything that kind of happened before we brought our son home, I felt like I wasn't really doing my part in normalizing these losses, which I think is so incredibly important to do.
And stats will show majority, in fact, of women have some kind of miscarriage in the course of their life.
Yes, I think stats are like 10 to 15% of known pregnancies experience a loss. Some say it's even more than that. And what I found, which was just really interesting, is that for African-American women, that's almost doubled because of access to healthcare and environmental factors and everything else. So this is something that is impacting so many people. And I think most who are listening to this, if they've not experienced it themselves or with their families or partners or friends, I can guarantee that there is, someone that they know who has experienced it, whether they know or not, because a lot of people just don't talk about it.
And to your point earlier, it's so much easier to focus on the celebration that often comes in some fashion after a miscarriage. So let's start with, tell me about your family.
Yes, I have 3 children. I had two of them biologically. They were very kind of, healthy pregnancies, pretty easy, birth stories, although my son was an emergency C-section, but ended up being great. And then my husband and I wanted to build our family. I'd always had it in my head that I wanted a third. And so we are, part of this segment of the population who experienced secondary infertility or like secondary pregnancy loss. So I think that, what I have come to realize in so many of my different conversations with people is that everyone's experience is so unique. A lot of them are experiencing miscarriages or pregnancy loss at their first attempts. Others are experiencing it after they've had children. And so it's just a very interesting experience that is so personal to so many people. But after these miscarriages and we had recurrent losses, we decided to pursue the adoption route. And so our youngest son helped grow our family through adoption.
So after you've had two children biologically, and then you get pregnant again and you have a loss, and then you get pregnant again and you have a loss, I imagine that it's such a different experience because you know what I'm using air quotes here, should be like. You've experienced a pregnancy full term. You've experienced that. So I suspect that that's different, and we don't know because you didn't have a miscarriage before you had your first child. But so many people struggle at the beginning, and you struggled. You said secondary infertility. So, how did you keep it together, for lack of a better term? Because you had two little ones that needed you. How do you go through the trauma and the struggle of that with people that need mom all the time?
Yeah. I mean, I think that for us, the first loss and hearing about the first loss was absolutely crushing, as it is for so many people. But for us, we had kind of had the great fortune of being able to experience these pregnancies and births with this kind of naivete, right? Like there was the typical usual, oh, we're a little bit worried about the pregnancy that everyone has, especially the first time around. But by the third time, we had come in and we heard the heartbeat. And so I thought, this is my third. I am smooth sailing. I am good to go. And when we came back that first time for the 12-week ultrasound, we found out that the baby had stopped growing around 10 weeks. And I will say I was a mess. I think that because I was not expecting it, it was very traumatic and crushing. And the doctor recommended a D&C, which is a procedure to kind of empty out your uterus. And I was in home and really in shock after that and disbelief. And while my husband was incredibly supportive, I operated as kind of the type A recovering perfectionist that I am. And I just thought, if I don't think about this, if I just jump back into work and I jump back into taking care of my two kids, it'll be okay. And so a night later, after the surgery, which is a pretty intense surgery, they put you under and you have to spend the day at the hospital. I was emceeing an event with over 300 people. And what I thought was doing a pretty amazing job at just putting this behind me and moving forward. And I'm sure every therapist listening to this is cringing right now because you can probably guess what happened next. It turns out that you cannot just stuff grief down and it disappears. It is something that has to be worked through. So I will say that I am probably not a good model for how you should deal with this type of loss, which is so traumatic. And I think is something about miscarriages that people they don't talk about it enough, that just how you have to give yourself time to grieve. And I did not do that. Each time I kind of threw myself back into the process to try again, when I was cleared medically, but I never saw a therapist or thought to, talk to others about what I was feeling.
How did you get to the point where you are now, where you're able to say, boy, had I done this, it would have been better?
I think therapy.
So you did eventually go.
I did. I actually did after the whole adoption process, because I do think that, quite frankly, stuffing all of that down we had 3 losses, and the next 2 were later. They were later in the pregnancies. And so I think that there was just a whole different kind of physical trauma that also came with that in terms of the emotional. And what I have heard from and talking to a lot of other different people, and I'm trying to start to become a resource to friends or friends of friends, or, others who are experiencing miscarriages or considering adoption, is that you almost become just so focused on, how am I going to do this right? I'm going to try again the next time, and I'm going to do everything I can. And honestly, I think a lot of the medical community doesn't help with that, because they don't tag something or refer to it as recurrent loss, which is when you can go see a specialist, until after 3 miscarriages. And so for me, my experience was going back and they were saying, this was just really bad luck. You should try again. And if we were, betting people, we would say, you will be fine. And honestly, it's usually just 1% of, of pregnancies or of women who experience recurrent loss. So it's small, but when you think of 1% of all women who are on this journey, it's actually quite a large number of women who are dealing with this. And so to have to go through that 3 times before you're able to, go see a specialist and try to understand what the issues or complications are, it's a very taxing process.
Because what people may not realize is that from the time it takes time to get pregnant, then you have to be confirmed pregnant, then you're pregnant for a while, then the loss happens, and then you have to wait before you can try again. So we're talking, 3 doesn't sound like it would have taken a long time, but it did. Was it 18 months, 2 years of your life?
Yeah, it was about 4 years.
Okay, that's a long time.
It is a long time. It is a long time. And it's interesting to look back because, having 2 other kids, and going back to your original question of just like, how do you do it with kids? I mean, I think that it's very foggy. And I think that there was life happening as we were navigating this. There was work, and there was family, and there were celebrations. And so there were other things that were going on, which almost makes it kind of easier to just push it aside and focus on this other stuff. And so it was it was a long process. I will say, talking to others, like, it doesn't feel that long compared to others who may have 8 years of infertility or miscarriage, or, many more than I had experienced. But it was a chunk of time in my life that I think happened, and that I needed to process to be able to sit here today and talk about this, and hopefully serve as a resource for others.
Thing that happens that I don't think everyone realizes, I didn't realize until I was trying to have my first child, is that there's something, I don't know if maybe you have a perspective on this, if it's taught to little girls, or if it's trained, or if we just believe this and it's lies, I don't know. But there's something about like your identity as being a woman. And I, for some reason, should be able to have a child and carry a baby. And then when it doesn't work the way that the fairy tales make it sound like, or all the women who are older than you, your aunties and your grandmas and whoever, who don't probably talk about a loss, if there is one, in a vulnerable way, then when it doesn't work, there's the shame piece that is like another added emotion in addition to grief and loss and trauma. So can you talk a little bit about that? Because I suspect it was a surprise for you.
Yes, completely. And as I mentioned, I think that there was a lot of, what could I have done differently? And in most cases, it is genetic, or it's something structural, or there's nothing that you could have done. But
it's not like that one tuna salad. If I wouldn't have had that one tuna salad.
Yeah. Oh gosh, that lunch meat, I should have grilled it. Yeah, it's not. And you are, it's drilled into your head early on in pregnancy, especially that first one, right? Like where you're real intense. And so again, by my third one, I was like, oh, kind of lax about it and thinking, oh, was that it? Was it that turkey sandwich I ate? And it wasn't. But I do think that you're right, that there is just so much shame And I think part of that is because of how we were raised, and that we are told that we are mothers and this is our role. And if we don't succeed in, that picture of what being a mother looks like, there's just a lot of shame and guilt around that. And I also think it's just society, because we don't talk about this enough. And and especially Americans, we like to focus on the good stuff, the baby, the Gerber baby, all of the marketing and the products for babies to get them to sleep, and the pictures and the first birthdays and all of that, because it's something celebratory. But there is, behind those closed doors, there's a very raw and traumatic experience for a lot of women where that is not your reality. And it's a lot harder, I think, for people to dig that up and to talk about it. For me personally, we're not talking about miscarriage and pregnancy losses at the book club. We're talking about who's pregnant, who's having the next baby. And so it's not normalized. And I think that really feeds into a lot of the shame that surrounds miscarriages.
I had 2 pregnancies. I've 2 children. I didn't ever have the loss. I know many people who have had, but I don't feel like I can empathize in a way that someone who has gone through this can. And I can say that from my experience, there's this, when you're trying to get pregnant, even if it happens quickly, the 24 hours every day and the counting down and the, can I take the test? Like it stretches into years. And I was pregnant at a time when there wasn't social media. So I remember it appeared that everyone around me was pregnant and everyone around me had babies. And now women who are on the pregnancy journey, wherever that may be, whether they're trying to get pregnant or have infertility or have just had a loss, not only is it everywhere around them, but social media is filled with gender reveals and all the things. And you can't get away from it if you're kind of in a certain age range. And even if you're not in a certain age range, the grandparents have the babies out there. It's a baby-centric sort of world. Did you choose during this time in your life to turn down your social media to avoid places where there would be babies? Or did you lean into that? I don't know. I just think that would be additional pain.
Yeah, I don't think that the social media was as painful and watching those experiences. And also because I did have the amazing good fortune of having 2 other kiddos at home. But I will say that for me, and I've talked to other women about this, like when I was pregnant, especially the last 2 times, and that they were later. And so we were getting into the second trimester and celebrating it. And of course, this had been my 5th pregnancy and I was popping. And so I was sharing it more. I felt more and more confident as the weeks went on. And then others were sharing their pregnancies. And so when I experienced that loss and then saw them go on in their pregnancies and have these babies, I think that was hard, and again, that feeds into the shame. Like, how should I really be feeling bad or, that someone else was able to experience this and I wasn't, when I already have 2 kiddos at home. But that was what was really hard and difficult for me, I think, is seeing people kind of pass that mark. And then even to this day, or a couple of friends who were pregnant at the same time, just seeing how, their son or daughter 4 or 5 or 6 and would be the same age as those babies. It's a constant reminder. And I think that points back to the fact that a lot of women who experience loss, and especially later loss, have some form of PTSD that can last a long time with them if it's not addressed. And there are things that can trigger you that you think you are well past it, where it brings you back. I mean, I know I went to the hospital, and it's a hospital that is in our community and I still go to, and there's a certain hallway that I'll walk down because it's the main hallway. And it just brings me back to right after we experienced those losses and having to go in for the surgery. And I think that it's something that is just constant, and that you have to learn how to sit with and acknowledge and not try to push it down, as I did in the beginning, and work through it as best as you can.
How do you talk to your children about their siblings that were lost?
They were pretty young. So they were 3 and 5, right around there, since this was 3 to 4 years in between that. So they were younger, but I remember at the time, especially my daughter, who was a little bit older, was grieving along with me and was really sad. And I think looking to me to talk about it. And we would come home and we would talk about it, but it's not something that we revisited a lot. And I wish that we had more. I don't know if I had just the emotional capacity at that point in time to sit down and really talk with them after that initial talk. But I think it's a good question. And it's something that I would recommend. It's one of those I wish I could go back and do over and have more conversations with them and ask them how they were feeling and how they were working through it. But, honestly, we didn't do enough of that. And then we entered into the adoption process pretty soon after my third miscarriage. And so that just became very much a family focus. And we included our kids throughout every stage of that process. And so for us, it was something that, was something to look forward to and to take the grief that we had experienced it and trying to transition it to building our family in a different way.
How did you and your husband make the decision that it was time to think about adoption? Because you could have said, 2, we're good. Or you could have said, let's just keep trying and let's just go through this again. And then there's the third option, which is let's adopt. What was the process of getting there?
Yeah. So after my third miscarriage, we had the privilege and good fortune of being able to see like a renowned fertility expert who was in Chicago. And so we went in and, it's interesting because I've talked about the percentages, right? And because that's what this whole process becomes. It's distilled down to, okay, what are my chances of having a miscarriage after after you hear a heartbeat, after the first trimester, okay, after you've had 1, after you have 2, it becomes kind of this analytics game, or at least for me, it did. And so we were part of that 1% and went to this fertility specialist. And I remember walking in and just seeing this waiting room filled with people and with families and realizing, wow, this 1% actually in reality feels a lot bigger. And the impact of that is really big. And you walk in and it's just palpable, just kind of how people are just so exhausted, I think emotionally and physically. And so we went to this doctor and she said, the way she explained it to us again in percentages was, okay, when you get here, there is probably a 70% chance that we will figure out what it is. It's a structural abnormality. You had a C-section with your son. Maybe there was some sort of tissue, scar tissue. Sometimes it's chromosomal. And these are all things that we can fix and work on. But for 30 to 40% that come in here, we just never know. And that's what I realized was that this, the fertility and miscarriage is a little bit like the Wild West of medicine, because you can't do as many tests on pregnant women or, on those who've had a miscarriage. And so there's a lot they still don't know while they've made amazing strides. And so we took all of these tests and one after the other was knocked down and was like, okay, that's not the issue. And I remember we had this final test, which I had convinced myself, this is why I'm going through it. And my husband had booked a trip to Italy for us. He was like, you've been through so much. You've always wanted to go. Let's go. And I remember we went to Italy and I was still waiting on the results of this final test. And so I'm there with my calling card and phone and calling them in. And we were there. And finally I got a hold of them and they said, we are so sorry to tell you, but you are part of that percentage of people that we don't know why this is happening to you. And so you can get pregnant again and we can give you progesterone and we can monitor you, but the chances are not great. And I remember just sinking back in the hotel bed and finally feeling like I give up, which was really hard for me. I give up. And I think about it in my head sometimes I talked about that first act and that second act. It's like a season. And it was like that final moment of the season. And I just looked at my husband and I said, let's adopt. And that's when the whole process began. And it's something that I had always been interested in, and something that I think it took a little bit longer to convince him to get on board. But we've ended up, pursuing that option.
And did he say, what? Or did he say yes? Or did he say, thank goodness I can't do this anymore? I mean, what was his reaction?
Yeah, I'm sure it wasn't as, like TV ready as, yes, let's do it. I think it was more of like, well, I know you've been talking about this for a while. I still have some concerns that we need to talk through. But I think it was more of like a, yes, let's think about this. Let's pursue it. And it took some time. And we've been trying to serve as a resource to some other couples who are considering the adoption journey. And for many of them, I think for many couples, there is usually, at least in our experience, there is usually one partner or spouse who is a little bit more hesitant and has some concerns, understandably so. And so it's honoring those and talking through those concerns and realizing that, yeah, it's a big decision. And I think that, both people obviously have to be on board to pursue it and navigate it together.
So talk a little bit about what that process was like. There's so many different paths with adoption. How did you find your path? How long did it take? And what's it like to hold that baby the first time?
Yeah. So our journey was relatively short. We were very fortunate in that sense. As I hear a lot about the forms, like, oh, there's so many forms, but I was on it and ready and organized, and it's not that overwhelming. Like, everyone can do the forms and the home study. I think what was incredibly helpful for us and was just a godsend was an adoption almost mentor. It was a friend of mine from high school that I lost touch with, and she had adopted 2 children. And I reached out to her saying, I don't know anything about this process. It feels very overwhelming. I have a lot of questions. I have a lot of, honestly, concerns. And she sat down and she spent hours talking to me about their experience and never saying, you should go this route. I think that she very selflessly spent the time and helped me to navigate it, but really wanted us to determine what path worked for us. And I think that that's probably one of my biggest suggestions, is that you should be honest with yourself about what you can take on and what will work best for your family. And like miscarriages, I think sometimes in having these conversations of, do I want to foster? Do I want to adopt? Do I want an infant? Is it bad if I want an infant and not an older child? And I think that there's a lot of shame in having those honest conversations, but I don't think there's just no shame in those discussions and deciding what is best for your family. Because I think that not all, but many people enter into the adoption process because of infertility or pregnancy loss. And so there's been such a lack of control in that journey for them. And in adoption, there's a lot that you can't control, but there are things that you can. And it's okay to have those tough discussions about race or substance exposure or, whatever it comes down to, and what works the best for you. And there actually is, I think, a lot of room and flexibility for you to make those decisions in the process. And I think that that's something that's not as known or talked about. And I think it's really important.
There is no right way to do things. And that's, I think, one of the really important things that happens when we share our stories, is that people can compare the different types of stories and the different types of experiences and the different types of journeys. Because some people who go through miscarriage and loss, they tattoo the names of the babies. They have services. Others choose to never speak of it or never tell their children, families that it even happened. And well, I would say that you should talk to someone. A therapist, fine, but someone, you got to get that, it has to come out. But there isn't a better way. It's your own path and your own way. And to your point of what we were just talking about, adoption is the same way. It isn't better to adopt younger or older or racially diverse or there's no better. It's just what's best for your family and what can you take on. So the way that you talked about that was so important. And I hope that resonates with people, because that perhaps is one of the difficult things. not just as it relates to this topic, but even as parents, my kid should be walking by this age. I should. And there is no should. It is, everyone has their own path. Every couple is different. Every situation is different. And we have to give each other grace and compassion to go through the journey wherever that takes us.
I think you're completely right. And I think it takes a village, and leaning on other people, whether that is through parenting, biological children or adopted children, or we are a transracial adoptive family. So our son is Black and Latino. And I think that we have found that we are very honest. And because my husband and I are both white, we have a very different set of lived experiences. And so it's even more important for us to, lean on resources and a community that can help us navigate raising him in a very diverse environment. And I think it's really important to know when to ask for help and when to seek out those mentors, whatever your journey looks like, whether that's through miscarriages, through parenting, through adoption. It's leaning on other people who have been there and can walk you through it.
Ask for help.
Yes. Ask for all the help. That's what I'm learning.
So how old is your son now?
He is 3.5.
That's a lot. A 3.5 that's a lot. I'm impressed that it's so quiet where you are. And
I know. Well, he's in daycare. The other's at camp, and the other I just, shuffled out of the house.
And you look very awake, because 3 little kids, like, bravo. Because there are days, right? There are days where the last thing you want to do is get on a Zoom call and talk about something that was so painful. So thank you for, sharing that. And what is your kind of number one takeaway? If someone is thinking about adoption, what's the one thing that nobody told you that you wish you would have known, or if you could have whispered to yourself when you were in that hospital with that second loss and where your life is now? What takeaways are there that can be picked up that you now have 20/20 vision on that you didn't? It's always clearer looking back.
I think that when you are in the middle of grieving or loss, or the anxiety around, throughout the adoption process of when is this going to happen? Because that looks different than a pregnancy, right? Like, you've got your 9 months out and when to plan. Adoption in many cases is not so clear cut, and you're not quite sure when it's going to happen. And I think that it is just trusting the journey and knowing that there's going to be some bumps and hurdles, but at some point you will bring the child home that is meant for you. And I can't take credit for that. That was like my, adoption mentor angel, Becky, who told me that, but I kept repeating that to myself throughout, especially the adoption process, that, eventually we will bring our baby home. And it may not look exactly as we had planned, but isn't that the beauty of life and the journeys that we navigate? And sometimes when you go off course and it's not as you had planned, it's more beautiful than you could have ever imagined.
That's well said. And before we end, I want to spend one section talking about the work that you do, because I had never, until I talked with you and your business partner, I never thought about it. And it's more present to me probably because the world has opened up and I've been to some graduation parties and I'm hosting a bridal shower and I have a wedding on my calendar. And I went to, and I had told you this previously, but I went to like 20 some graduations.
It's a lot of graduation parties.
It's a lot of, how expensive it is to go to 20 let's just take a minute. Yes, it's a lot of graduation parties. And I could walk into some and say, well, this is going to be fun. And I could walk into others and say, how long do we have to be here? And there's a vibe that happens, and your whole business is about the connection between place and space and that magical vibe, which I know this is your area and you probably don't use the word vibe because there's scientific and special words, but talk about what that is, that feeling, and how those of us who are trying to either a living room, a nursery, a party, whatever, like how do we latch on and get the feeling that goes with a good space?
Yeah. So I talked about kind of one of our founding principles was to elevate, the stories of women in planning and design within their own communities. But the other founding kind of mission that we have is to create places that spark joy. And that may mean a lot of different things for different people. And there's actually a fantastic book that I will plug, and it's called Joyful. And it's by Ingrid Fittelli. And it's wonderful. And she kind of breaks down in a very scientific way how the design of places can evoke joy. So we do a lot of community branding, but we also do a lot of placemaking, which are these kind of interventions that have color and movement and public art that bring communities together and engage them in a way where they feel like they are in a very special place that is uniquely their own.
So it is those personal connections or those personal, again, it's all back to story, the whole, as a beautiful bow on our whole conversation, share your stories. And if you're going to have a space or a party or a moment, bring yourself into it. And there isn't a right way to do that because every person is different. But in thinking about those graduation parties, the ones that were special that I remember are the ones that had something really unique that was connected to the family or to the child or to the culture. We were at the most amazing Indian graduation party, which I'd never been to. And my son was dancing with the graduate's mother, and there was the Indian music. And it was really special because it meant something to that family. And some spaces, parties, whatever it might be, are very like, well, this is what we do. This is like what have some pulled pork sandwiches and here's a place for your cards. And there's nothing that's like unique. And it feels different. Yeah,
you totally nailed it. And I think that when it comes to urban design, there's that kind of, there can be that very template approach, right? If it worked in this community, it'll work in this one. And it looks like a stamp. And it's almost like being at a mall where you're like, I could probably be anywhere right now. Where am I? And what is it about this place and the people that live here that feels like, okay, I know that this is where I'm at. And so we try to infuse that in a lot of the work that we do. And some of it is temporary, where things pop up and they can change week to week, depending on what people want to see and the different stories that they're telling. So I'm incredibly fortunate to have the opportunity to be doing this work day to day. And also just want to acknowledge that the accelerator program, of which you are a founding member, was such an amazing opportunity. I think, just being able to learn from female CEOs like yourself who have done it and who have done it successfully, for us who have taken a leap, especially in this kind of crazy time, and to be able to tap into the brain power and the networks. It's just truly a gift. So you should be very proud of what you've built there.
Thank you. It's so much of the way that I think we're similarly minded is that we believe that it's important to share stories and shared experience. And for me with this business, there were a lot of things I didn't know who to ask. I didn't know where to go. And I made some mistakes, and I did some things that if I could go back, I would have done differently. Now, the struggle is what made me learn and made me grow. And I don't want to relate the process of having this and building this company or any company to the difficult journey that is what you've been through in your personal life. However, the thing that is true for both is that it's not what it looks like on the outside. And it never is. And it's so important that, and it's one of my just personal deep beliefs, that we have to find people that we can help through sharing stories. First, that looks different for everybody. It might be a social media post, might be, working with Accelerator through the WEI, which is one of the things that I'm involved with. It might be buying coffee for someone and saying, looks like you're having a hard day. whatever it is, I just feel like we all have an obligation to share the stories of what we've been through because we can help someone else. And that's just such an overarching theme of this podcast, of my life and what you're doing with your work and with your family. So I applaud you for your willingness to open up about all the different things. And I love someone who loves a story like I love a story.
Yes, we are the story lovers.
Yes.
And I didn't cry, which is shocking. There were some bets made that I would definitely cry during this podcast, and I didn't. So
I suspect that people listening maybe, because, you're further out from the trauma and there are also people that have buried the grief. And if you bury the grief, it comes out. It comes out in ways that it will until it's dealt with, frankly, until it's handled and processed. And there's healing.
I think that is definitely my biggest takeaway is to sit with that and deal with that and recognize that it is just a very traumatic experience. And there's one other point that I just wanted to make, that there's a lot of research that women who experience a pregnancy loss, especially a later pregnancy loss, have PTSD levels that are like comparable to people coming back, soldiers coming back from war. And that blew me away, but in a way it made me feel validated that this pain and, the grieving process that maybe had not been recognized in society is a real thing. And it's okay to take time to work through that because it's mega.
And generally, those types of traumatic events are not meant to be dealt with alone.
It takes a community. And I think especially a community of families or women who have gone through it. It's what really helped me over time. I think being able to share those stories and talk with other women who are experiencing it, and you just don't feel so alone. And I think that step by step, we as women will normalize it, and we will build, I think, the network, both the medical and the social network that is needed, and that infrastructure to help women get through this, because they deserve it.
Yes, they do. And don't forget about the men or partners walking alongside, because nothing physical is happening to them. But my goodness, the pain and agony and grief of something that they thought that isn't, is real. And those folks need support too, because I think oftentimes nobody's asking them. Because if the person who's pregnant isn't talking, then certainly the partner can't be talking, because that is there's just a lot of complicated things. So it's really important that all the people involved are seeking help and talking, because otherwise it simmers.
Yeah, I think that's a really good point. My husband was such an amazing support system for me, and he needed that as well throughout the process.
You may have already given a quote. I'm not sure, because you talked about what the mentor angel had said, so I'm not sure, but perhaps there's another quote. But we always end the podcast with, was there a quote or something that helped you get through the difficult days?
There actually was. And it points back to this concept of grief that we have been talking about. And it's by, I'm hoping that I don't butcher this name, but Elizabeth Kubler-Ross, right, who focused on the stages of grieving. And she said, the most beautiful people we have known are those who have known defeat, known suffering, known struggle, known loss, and have found their way out of those depths.
Beautiful. We will put that wonderful quote, as well as the book that Marisa talked about, and some different resources for people who may be struggling with grief, struggling with loss, struggling with infertility, on the Flip Your Script website. And Marisa talked about so many things. And one of the things that I think we can all relate to wherever we are in our journeys is there a gaping hole? Is there something that is sitting in you that you're not yet ready to talk about, not yet ready to process? Is there an action plan, a way to move forward? Is it hiring a therapist? Is it journaling? There are a lot of different ways to process a story, but not processing is likely damaging short-term and long-term. So I encourage you, identify what that hole is that needs sharing, that needs light on the darkness, and talk to someone about it. My hope is that Marisa's story empowers you to believe you're capable of more than you think, to discover motivation, to uncover inspiration, and to find the strength to turn the page.
Thank you for listening to Flip Your Script, hosted by Kristi Piehl and produced by Media Minefield. If you like our message, please be sure to give us a 5-star rating, subscribe to the show, and share our episodes with your family and friends. Do you or someone you know have a story about flipping your script? We'd love to share it. Contact us on our website, flipyourscriptpodcast.com. To stay up to date on all things Flip Your Script, make sure to follow host Kristi Piehl on social media. You can also check out the website for pictures, resources mentioned in the show, and other great episodes.